Neutral is a place of no movement. It means you're not making progress towards the goals or the ideas that are really important to you. Welcome to Beyond Neutral, where we talk about what gets you stuck and how we can shift and navigate the road forward. As leaders, as professionals in our careers, or just balancing and creating the kind of life you desire. I'm your host, Paula Reed. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to today's episode of Beyond Neutral. I'm your host, Paula Reed. So, as you know, if you've listened to this podcast before, this is really dedicated to talking about and exploring the concept of getting unstuck, okay? Moving beyond a place of neutral, right? Of no movement or creating movement. And that movement could be around our careers, our leadership, in relationships, in transitioning in life, but it's that concept of you're in a place and you want to get to a different place. And so sometimes that neutral space is paralyzing, right? You get paralyzed. You can't figure out how to get out of it. Other times that neutral space is exactly where you need to be. And the key is being intentional about getting there, being intentional about what you're doing in it, and then using that insight as a way to move forward. And I say that because what I really wanted to talk about today is a follow-up to the conversation that I had in our last episode around agency, right? And how important it is to have agency. And I talked about agency as being the recognition that you have choices, the recognition that you have options in any situation. And the importance of understanding that you have choices and then being intentional about how you act on them and how you go forward. And that is basically true in any situation that we encounter. So in an interesting juxtaposition, one of the key ways to create agency is to be in neutral. Okay. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that concept of intentionally moving to a space of neutral, or what I like to call, with a lot of my coaching clients, I talk about it as the great pause. So this concept of moving to this space of neutral so that you can be deliberate and intentional about how you want to move out of it. It can be really significant when it comes to behavior change. It also is very significant when it comes to bigger issues, right? So part of it is when you're in a space of neutral or you're in a space of no movement is what you do to understand where you are and how you look to that moment, how you gain insight from that moment in order to move yourself forward. But what I really wanted to talk about today is what I would call the small neutral, okay? Creating that space, creating that pause for yourself when you're trying to create a new behavior or you're trying to basically interrupt a feedback loop that may be a part of you unknowingly, okay? And how do you go about that? There's this quote by Viktor Frankl, and if you're not familiar with him, Viktor Frankl is a very well-known Austrian psychiatrist. Did a lot of work in one particular branch of psychiatry. He was also a Holocaust survivor. But the thing is, he's written a number of books and has some phenomenal quotes. And the quote that I love best of his is this, and I will read it so that I say it properly. The quote is, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." So between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. That's agency. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So that entire quote is really about stepping into this neutral space or stepping into a pause in order to be intentional about how you want to move forward. And it's really important in behavior change. And agency is about changing the story you're telling yourself and how you're responding in order to recognize your thoughts, your feelings, your wants, and advocate for them for yourself, okay? This is all about creating space. So if we think about this from a behavior standpoint, oftentimes, and this is especially present when we're in a conflict situation, right? You have a situation with somebody else that makes you uncomfortable. And quite often that can be a pattern. Okay. And I can think of several clients who, some of our initial work was on creating space in order to have less emotional responses to situations of conflict. Because the reality is, people talk about being conflict avoidant, right? There's a spectrum of how conflict avoidant people are, but most people don't love conflict. There are people who thrive on conflict, but, a lot of people don't enjoy conflict. And what can happen is you can get into this pattern of responding to it in a way that's not serving you or responding to it without agency. And so in this juxtaposition of realizing that you need to actually move to neutral in order to move out of it or in order to create a new behavior pattern, there are a number of things that you can do in order to create that pause. And that pause, that neutral space, is so very important. So I've worked a lot with clients on slowing down the way, first of all, number one, being aware of what's happening in their body in those situations. Your body is an unbelievable source of data. And the key is to learn how to pay attention to it. So I work with clients a lot on paying attention to the physical things that are happening to them in situations where they're not responding in the way that they want to, or in situations where they know they need a behavior change. And quite often, if you are able to tune into that, that gives you what you need in order to kind of rewire that feedback loop. So I will work with clients on, being aware of what's happening in their body. And as they can feel that happening to them, interrupting it somehow, some physical change. I've had clients who've twisted a ring. I know people who intentionally take their bracelets or their wristwatch from one arm and put it on the other as a way to create space for themselves and allow themselves to think and pause and gather the response that they're looking for, or gather insight into how they're feeling and what they're thinking, and really being thoughtful about how they want to move forward rather than being reactive to it. So the key thing is that neutral is actually a phenomenal place to be in, as long as you're intentional about what you're learning from that process. And that's true in, when people talk about being stuck. I'm in this place, I'm really stuck. Okay, what is that stuck thing feeling like? What does it, if we're shifting that from we're not talking about behavior change now. We're talking about, you have a challenge around leadership. You have a challenge around your career. You're trying to figure out how to tell a different story to yourself in order to move forward. It's understanding what that pause, because you're in a pause. Neutral is a pause, right? It's a pause of movement. What are you learning from being in that? And what insights are you gaining? And so a lot of times I'll spend a lot of times with coaching clients really sitting in that space and owning that space. If it's a big shift you're looking for, if it's a behavioral shift that you're looking for and it's in the moment, then it's anticipating that space and thinking about how you actually want to come out of that when you get into it. And that pause can absolutely be used in the moment, and it can be used in anticipating the moment. So anticipating those conversations that are going to be hard and thinking about how you want to respond to them in a different way, or how you want to put yourself into a situation of pausing. It can be used in, things that create anxiety for you. So having to make a presentation and fearing that anxiety that builds up prior to that presentation. It can be pausing ahead of that to anticipate what that's going to feel like and create a new feedback loop. So creating the new feedback loop is another step in the process. But the key here, and what I really wanted to make sure that I focused on today, was that neutral space, that pause, is a really important place to get to or to be in. The key is to use that time and that space that you've created for insight, and to then, based on that insight, create agency, which is I have control over how I want to move forward. I have options on how I want to move forward from this space. But in order to move forward, you have to be there in the first place, right? So that's kind of the conversation that I wanted to have today on Beyond Neutral. So in order to move beyond neutral, you have to get there first. I guess that's the big takeaway. And learning how to get there and learning how to, and developing the skills to create the insight that teaches you, that's the key. And that's where coaching can be really beneficial to people. So happy to talk further with anybody who's got questions about that or looking for further insight on it. And that's it. That's my talk of the day. I hope everybody's having a great week, and keep driving. Talk to you soon. Thanks so much for joining us on this week's episode of Beyond Neutral. Make sure to visit our website, www.readandco.com, for this week's show notes. That's reidnco.com. And if you found value in today's episode, I would really appreciate you giving us a rating on Apple Podcasts, or better yet, share it with a friend. Also, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. All of this helps to support the show. Thanks so much. Take care.